So I have this question here from Jonathan Atkins, who is a PhD student doing some research, and he's taking my course, R Shiny Flexdashboards and Interactive Data Visualizations, to take some of this work and research that he's done using text sentiment analysis techniques to be able to present his findings in a more appealing type of way. So he's actually not got one question here, he's actually got 5 different questions here. So it's really cool to see that he's really gotten into this and done quite a bit of stuff. And he's got some great questions here. So there is quite a bit to get through, but I think this should be really interesting, and it is so good to see students actually engaging and actually using this material. So let's go ahead and start to go through this. If you're new to this channel and you're keen to learn the latest tips, tricks, and tools for working more effectively with data, please hit the subscribe button for weekly videos. So now the gist of this is that he's actually already written a whole bunch of different R scripts. And what he's looking to do is pull these together and drop them into a Flex dashboard so that he can use the research that he's already done. Now he sent me a bit of code here. And so just taking a little bit of a look through this, there's a few things that kind of stand out to me here. So I just want to take a few moments to go through some of this. The first thing that pops out to me here is that he's got a set working directory. Now, generally speaking, I never use the set working directory command. And the reason for that is that because this creates an absolute path to a directory on your computer, which means if these files ever move, or if you were turning this into, say, a Shiny application which you need to pop up on a server, then all of these paths don't work anymore and they break. So there is a better way of doing this first step, which is to set up something called an R project. Now, in order to do that, I'm just going to quickly pop over to RStudio. It's very easy. There's a button over here called Create a Project. So I can come over here. I can create a new directory, a new project. And let's just call this sentiment analysis. So it's switching over to this project here. And you can see up here in the console, we have R sentiment analysis. So this is the new working directory for this project. And every time that this project loads, it will automatically create, it will automatically set the working directory for you. And again, the significance of that is that you're never hard coding the working directory into your code, which is a really important thing when you start to build out dashboards. So actually, let me start a new script as well. And let's take his code here, and I'm just going to copy all of this and pop it into our editor. Okay, so there's a bit of code here. So first of all, I can take out this first line. Don't need that anymore. And when we're looking at code, we can always break it down into certain chunks, right? So we have this first line here, which is effectively loading the data. We've got the loading of the libraries. Then effectively, we have some sort of transformation on the data or some processing of the data. And then we have a visualization. So we've got a visualization here. We come down here, we've got another loading of a library. We've got some more sort of processing, followed by another visualization. So really 3 kind of main steps: load, process, and visualize. And so what we want to be able to do is break this down into chunks, which we can call into a dashboard. Because if we want to lay out our components in different places, so visualization 1 and visualization 2, we want to maybe drop that into 2 different panels. We want to be able to call that specific visualization separately from each other. Now, there's a few other things as well. So what we're going to start to do is we're going to start to cover off basically the concept of functional programming. So in programming or in R, you can create functions. So this line here, we could call this function. Sorry. Call this set up a function called, say, load my data, and we'll set that as a function there. And maybe we could set a file, and we can set the default value equal to this. Okay, and move that up into there. And call that file. Right? Now, you might be wondering, this line here, it's only one line. So why on earth would you want to turn this into a function? Well, the reason for this is because when you run through a script, it basically just runs everything in the script. When you start to move into dashboard development instead, or kind of building applications and programs, you don't necessarily want to run this entire script every single time. Imagine you had a really, really big data file. Let's say you had a data file which was a gigabyte, and that had to load every time before you did any processing or visualization of it. That would be a huge waste of processing. Really reading the data off the disk is one of the kind of big kind of bottlenecks in programs that kind of make them really slow, especially if you're reading off a hard disk instead of like a solid state drive, if you're reading off a network, or even if you're querying a database. All of these things can create major bottlenecks which massively slow down your code. So there's no point in like reloading the data every time if you can, say, load it once into the application and then call that same data set multiple times through other sort of processing functions and visualizations. So that's why we want to create a function around this so it only does it once. Now, the second thing here is I noticed that this is using read.csv. So read.csv is a function which is available in base R. One of the things that I generally teach people to do is to use the TidyVerse methods for doing all of these kind of things instead. And that would basically use read_CSV instead of read.csv. One of the benefits of this is that this string is factors. So Jonathan here has set string is factors is equal to false, this is pretty much what you want to do most of the time, right? Unless you're going straight into something like a logistic regression, you want to set string is factors equal to false. Now, if you use read_CSV from TidyVerse, you don't actually need to do this at all. That's actually kind of the default parameter, so you can take that piece out. The other benefit of it is that if you have column names with spaces in it, read.csv will insert dots into those in place of spaces, which kind of messes up the column names and makes them sort of different from the original source, which, to be honest, I think is a bit of a pain. There's a whole bunch of other little things as well. I have like a whole video on why I would always use read_CSV instead of read.csv. So I'll provide a link to that as well. So if you want more details, you can check that out. But this definitely generally helps a lot, especially if you're using TidyVerse functions like dplyr and ggplot. In fact, these are all TidyVerse functions. So you could actually load the library TidyVerse for a lot of these instead. Right? And that will kind of replace those. Okay, now I don't have all these packages installed here. And I also don't have a Jonathan's dataset, so I won't be able to run all of this. But I'm just going to talk through it, swap out certain parts for generic built-in datasets within R. And okay, so here we have this is a LuberDate function, and we're setting a date. Again, if you're to follow TidyVerse standards, you would use the mutate function instead of this this dollar function here. Again, this would be, let's just call this data prep 1. Right, and typically you would put your data in here. And then this would be something like dt mutate date equals, oops, mdy date, right? So that's how you would do it in TidyVerse instead, and also turning it into a function so that you'd be able to call that into your code. Okay, here we have our plot. So I'm just going to replace this with a generic plot just for this example. So let's call this plot 1 function data, and you'd basically put your ggplot thing in here. So ggplot, let's use something like mpg, and let's use something like geom point static x equals, let's see, what are some of the things that we have in here? Okay. Okay. So yeah, if I was making this a function, I wouldn't put mpg there because it would be piping in dt instead. So I should actually delete this. But just for this example, let's just take a quick look at that. Right. So there's our little scatter plot. I can get rid of that. Also, these are specific to that specific data set, so just need to watch out for things like that. So we'll spend a little bit of time basically converting our code into functions. So everything wrapped around in a function like this with these little curly braces is only going to run when we call that function. So let's set up a new Flex dashboard. So I'm just going to come over to here, R Markdown. Okay, so I just recently upgraded my version of R to 3.51. So I don't have the Flex dashboards template in here. So I'm just going to install that. So I'm just going to come over here, install packages, Flex dashboards. So this is one of the things, every time you upgrade your version of R, you often have to go off and reinstall all your favorite packages again. Anyway, here you go. So let's try it again. R Markdown from template, and now I have Flex dashboard up here. So I'm going to click OK. And so here I have a blank Flex dashboard template. Let's just get rid of some of these. These are kind of default values anyway, so if I'm happy with those, I can delete those. to make this a little bit more compact and easier to read. Let's just make this bigger again. Okay, so I've got different sections of the Flex dashboard here. And this top part here, okay, I don't need to include library Flex dashboard actually. I mean, what this basically does is it includes a few extra controls, a few little widgets and stuff that are specific to Flex dashboards, which you can use. But if you're not actually using any of those, this will work just fine without it. I can, let me save this actually. So let me save this file and let me just call this sentiment analysis. So what you would do here is you would use the command source, and if I add in quotation marks and hit tab, then I get a list of everything in my working directory. So I can hit tab to complete that for me, and that's going to source in this script, which means it's going to run everything in here. But what you have to remember is with functions, I accidentally delete my function before. There we go. Okay, is that, and I'm just going to get rid of these so that this doesn't all run right now. Is that when I source this in, it's going to call it's going to load everything in here. So the functions will run, but this code inside of here, sorry, what did I just say? So these functions will load into the environment, but this code inside the function won't run until you actually call it in the specific locations inside of your other code. So here, you want to basically do all of the upfront stuff. So these are the things like load my data, actually what I call my functions. So I've called them load my data, data prep, and plot one. So I could say load my data. Nope, actually I haven't run that line yet. Let's just run that. Let's just get rid of this for now. This is just an example anyway, so I don't need this library for this example. Okay, here's all my functions. So load my data. Okay, and then you could, it's got a default file here anyway, but anyway, so you'd load data. That's not actually going to work since I don't have Jonathan's files. And then the data prep. So data prep. Now, here's one of the things that you have to sort of think about when you're starting to build these kind of things. Is the data prep something that just happens one-off? So a lot of the time we have data which is not very clean, and we send it through a whole number of processes in order to clean it up so that we can start to analyze it and use it. And often that only needs to be done once. And let's say you only take your data, for argument's sake, for a monthly reporting cycle, and that happens once a month. Then really your data prep script only needs to run like once a month as well. So you can do these in batch, and this can actually save a lot of time. It can make your applications run a lot faster. So here I'm sticking in the dashboard. Again, it depends your reason for doing this. You can turn this into an application, in which case I would not do the data prep here. I would basically do the load data and data prep off in a separate script, save it down as, say, like an RDS file, and then just load the RDS file directly into here. And that's going to make the load time of an application significantly faster than doing these steps here. Now, for some people like Jonathan, he's a PhD student, he's doing some research. Often researchers use other things like Jupyter notebooks for this kind of thing, and they want to kind of basically just kind of show all of their steps all in here. for the sake of kind of reproducibility. It's still, I think, in my opinion, a lot cleaner to use functions, because you can always go back and kind of look into the functions instead of having massive amounts of code sort of embedded within your sort of text and research. But that's just kind of my opinion. It's I just think it's a lot cleaner. Now, again, depending on whether you make this kind of interactive or not, the data visualizations can actually have parameters in them using different controls, where you kind of flick the controls and the visualizations update and change. If there are inputs in your model, that could be part of the data processing. So if those get updated by little drop-down menus and sliders and everything in your dashboards, then you definitely want to have them in here so that they can do that. Right? So here would be my plot 1, right? And so one of Jonathan's questions was, how do I kind of pull my research into a dashboard? So again, this is chart A, chart B, chart C, 3 different sections. If I wanted to add another section, I could really just come over here and I could, say section 4, right? And then add another R code chunk in here. So let's insert a code chunk. You can see here as well that you can add stuff from all kinds of different languages as well. So you can add Python, SQL, and all these other things. So by splitting this into functions, then I can specify exactly where I want each plot to go, because I can basically put, say, plot 2 in there once I figure out what my plot 2 is, plot 3, right? Plot 4. Right, and basically we're assuming that all of these have been set up as functions, so that it's just really nice and easy. And again, this is a R Markdown document, which means I can write some text here, everything to do with plot 2. Right, and you can just write these things, and these are text which is going to show up with each of these graphics with that header on top. So there are actually a few different questions that Jonathan asked here. So one of them was, okay, I've got all these different R scripts. How do I take them and put them into a Flex dashboard? That's kind of more or less what we've kind of covered there, to basically turn them into functions. He's got a few other questions here about some errors that he's getting, some difficulties that he was having with his plot. Let's just take a quick look over this. This one's kind of interesting, actually. So here you notice here that he's setting up a ggplot, and that he's adding basically all of these different bars. So one of the things I noticed about this that pops out straight away is that this is really quite long. So we've got feel disgust, feel joy, feel fear, feel sadness, feel trust, feel anger. And all of these have been manually set to different colors, right? Which is quite a bit of work. Basically what this tells me is that the way that his data is set out is that his data is coming in wide format as opposed to long format. So another kind of key concept is the concept of tidy data, which generally means your data comes in long format. So what I would do, instead of like replicating this like so many times and manually filling in the colors, is I would basically use some functions like gather. Let me show you how to do that actually, which will basically take the wide data and turn it into a long data format. So you could just say this, this is the, I guess the mood, right? That the fill is equal to the mood, right? And then it will automatically assign a color to it. And that's going to be a lot easier than having this code here like this. So let me just come back to R. And let's just chuck this in somewhere. Let me just, yeah, I'll chuck it in here. So let me call this plot, let's just call this plot 2. Normally you'd kind of set your data in there and that sort of thing. So for this, we're going to say, I'm just going to hard code this for now. So mpg ggplot. Actually, let me show you something first. So I'm assuming that you kind of know what the MPG dataset actually looks like. So the MPG dataset is this table that looks like this. It's a bunch of cars basically, with information about the mileage, and it is in a long data format. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to convert this into a wide data format, which this is what I think Jonathan's data looks like, which is why he's written the ggplot function the way that he has. So this will be, say, group by displacement and say class summarize, say highway equals sum of highway. Okay, so this is a summarization of this data set here. It's still in long format, so let's use the function spread. And this is a little bit like doing a pivot table. So I'm going to use class and highway, and this is basically going to convert it into a wide data format. So here we can see that this has been basically transposed. Let me add one more parameter in here, which I think people will find handy, is fill zeros. That just fills in all the NAs. Okay. Oops. Okay. And once you have a wide format, how do you turn it back into a long data format again? Well, to do that, we would use a function called gather. So the way that gather works here is that, okay, you have the data, which is already piped in from all of this. This is my wide data frame, effectively. So that part's already done. The next value is the key. And so in this case, my key, basically, I've got this these labels across the top, which should form the column class. And then I have my values, which are basically highway. And I'm going to take take off this placement there. Okay, and that converts it back into a long data format. Now we've got all these zeros here that basically wouldn't have been there before. Let me just take that off there, and now it's going to produce the NAs. And so from here I can go NA RM equals true, and that kind of gets me back to this, right? So I hope that kind of makes sense. So basically, if you have a wide data format that looks like this, instead of using a ggplot, so let's come back to Jonathan's code, and using this fill for each thing here, you can use something like gather instead to take this and convert it into a long data format, which you can then do your ggplot off instead. So let's say pop that into ggplot, and let's do a geom column. So I'm just quickly setting in X, Y, and fill is equal to, and let's set that to, what do we have again? We had class, right? Okay. Okay, so there we go. So you can see that that can be more or less done with one line instead of having to have one for each column. So you know, that's hopefully a little tip that should help out make this a lot cleaner. Let's see if we can tackle some of his other issues that he has here. So he's got basically the gist of these questions here is that he's got this kind of output issue where he's getting this kind of output here. Again, he's he's basically tried to stick all of this code directly into his dashboard, which I don't recommend doing. Like I said, I would convert these into functions, source it in, and then call the functions in the appropriate locations. Now, in terms of actual output, though, let me show you something else that could be handy. Now, each of these, you notice here, if you can see some of this color coding, this is called an R chunk, right? So we have a YAML header, R chunk, markdown, R chunk, markdown, R chunk, right? So actually, I shouldn't call it an R chunk. It's an R chunk because of this R over here, but it can be other things. This is a code chunk. So, but here we can actually set different parameters for it as well. So here we haven't set any parameters at all, but we've got all of the things like show warnings, show messages. So we can like basically take these things off, right? So message equals to false, warnings equal to false, and you know we can apply those. And there's if we do this, then certain of the output that we don't want to display won't show up basically. So you have a fair bit of control over that, and you can basically get access to those by clicking these little cog buttons like so, right? So you've got a few more options here as well. So output, you can show output only, code and output, show nothing, just run the code, show nothing, don't run the code, right? So you've got all of these different options as well. Okay. So I think that pretty much covers. I think that should pretty much cover anything, everything. And I mean, so Jonathan, if you have any further questions about this, do let me know. But give these things a try. I hope they help you out. It's kind of a longish kind of session. It's kind of gone around the bend a bit, but I hope that helps. And I will see you next time. If you found this video helpful, please give a thumbs up. It really helps out a lot to keep the channel going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.